Why hello everybody, my name is Kaylee J, and today I will be showing you my process in making what I call a gathered wrap skirt. I was inspired by Angela Clayton, who is an amazing costumer on YouTube, and I will link her tutorial for her rectangle skirt below. However, I didn't want to put in a zipper. They're a bit difficult for me, and instead I wanted to learn how to sew in buttonholes, and thus I came up with my own little concoction. I will list all the materials you will need in the description box below, and without further ado, let's begin the tutorial. Now comes the critical part, the math. Stop screaming, stop crying, okay? Close your butt cheeks. It's much easier to go through the numbers when you're relaxed, okay? I'm going to walk you through it all the way. Angela Clayton does a really good job in her tutorial. Here's a screenshot. However, because mine is a wrap skirt tutorial, my measurements came out a little bit differently. And so the skirt part is practically the same, but the waistband is different. So let's begin there. The waistband here, and because I didn't want to buy lining, I ended up having to fold over the waistband hot dog style. And in order to do that, I wanted the length of that. I wanted the width of the waistband really to be about 2.5 inches. And so I folding it over 2.5 times 2, just when you're coming up with like the hem and estimating the seam allowance, I estimated about 5 inches in the width. And so in order to determine this length, you will need to know the measure of your waist. Now I am 26, 25 on a good day, so I just estimated that my waist is 25 inches. Now the formula for a wrap skirt, how long you need the waistband to be, how this is calculated is your waist plus the amount of overlap you want. Yes, cuckoo clock. Thank you very much. It's 11 o'clock. Plus, with the seam allowances from here to here on those hems, it is going to be about 1/2 inch on both sides, just for safety, 1 inch. 1 inch of a hem. So, all that will equal the length of your waistband. And for my formula, it is 25, plus I estimated 10 inches, plus the hem of 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side, 1 inch, and it ended up being 36 inches in length of the waistband. So that's 36. Now also, this is just to keep in mind that you will be measuring where you want the buttons to be. Now, I cannot estimate that right now. It ended up being, I believe, this side 9 inches and this one almost 9 inches, like 8.75, but it was much easier to measure it once I actually had the skirt come together, and then I measured where I want the holes to be, the holes and the buttons to be. So that's just for reference right now. Don't take any measurements just yet. And so now what comes next is the actual skirt. Now, to estimate the skirt, you will need to know the desired length. And for this, I just estimated that I wanted my skirt to be 21 inches long. And with this, I am referring to, hold on, here's the waistband, here's the skirt. I'm referring to the measurement from here to here. Just so we're clear, Now, I quickly realized that this can be quite complicated, so I am just going to take my notes and try to re-explain this skirt portion as best as possible. So, what we've estimated is that I need this side for my pattern of the skirt to be length plus the hem, which I have estimated to be 22.5 with the hem of 1.5 inches. And my desired length is 21. So now, 3 times my waist, or waistband rather, because I just estimated that's 36, 36 times 3 is, it comes out to be 3 yards, because 36 divided by 12, that's 3 feet, that's a yard. 108 inches, or rather 3 yards. Now these are the measurements of what I need. That's the pattern that we have to go for. So this is my minimum width of length of skirt rather that I need. So if this is my minimum length, you could just buy it like this. You could buy your skirt pattern just like this. However, because these bulks of fabric are bought in measures of 45 inches or 60 inches, I want to get the best bang for my buck, and I don't want to waste all that fabric. I also don't have a lot of storage in my house, so what are we going to do? How we are going to conserve this fabric is that we are going to cut them based on 3s, and then we estimate the amount that we need based on the length plus the hem in addition to our waistband. So when you cut these, they are going to be cut based on 45 or 60 on each. But you measure these with chalk and cut them based on the length plus the hem. So in the end, you should end up, after you cut them together, 3 pieces of skirt plus a waistband. This is just to help visualize it better. So this edge is actually going to be gathered. And when you take these and put it like this is the length that you get, and then they are cut in cuts of 45 inches. That was the pattern that I chose, so let's just go with that. So when you sew these edges together, what do you come up with? When you times 45 3 times, that equals 135 inches. So when you sew these together, you actually end up with 3.75 yards, which, if you've noticed, based on our minimum of 3 yards that we need, that is well over 3 times our waist measurement that we need. So this is great, but how much fabric do you actually need to buy based on these measurements? Well, to estimate that, 22.5 times itself 3 times, not times itself 3 times, 22.5 times 3, come on Kaylee, come on, plus 5, because 36 goes within 45. This is how you will end up cutting it at the end, and you just plus it by 5 based on the width of your waistband. So when you calculate this all together, 22.5 times 3 plus 5 equals 72.5. Now, this is the good part. When you divide it based on 1 yard, you end up, ladies and gents, with just over 2 yards of fabric. Now this is what you need. You need 2 yards of fabric as an estimate, because when you cut these together, you're not wasting any fabric and you got everything you need just to start off. So just so we're clear, this is what you get, this is what you need for the waist and the skirt when you cut it into thirds. And so I hope I explained that as best I could, and now let's continue on with the tutorial. If you managed to survive the math portion of this video, congratulations! Now we may proceed to cut out those rectangles based on the measurements that we just had. So you can see me here measuring out the fabric based on the length, which is 22.5 as previously mentioned, and marking those out with chalk. I also used a ruler to make sure that the lines were straight, and then I obviously cut them out with fabric scissors. Now you may be wondering why I chose puzzle pieces for this particular project. Well, when I purchased the fabric at Hobby Lobby in the middle of May, it was Autism Awareness Month. And not a lot of people know this, but I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at a rather young age. So this is a pretty big part of my life, and I just wanted something to commemorate to it. Set the fabric for the waistband aside, and now you may begin pinning the fabric together, right sides facing each other. Now, when I'm referring to the right side of the fabric, I mean the colorful side of the fabric, the side that people are going to see. And when I refer to the wrong side of the fabric, it's this really light faded color, the fabric that no one's going to see. And then I just proceeded to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And now, because the fabric was sewn on the selvage, we don't really need to worry about finishing off those edges. So I just sewed it about a 1/2 inch just to be sure that it was hidden once it's actually sewn together. Iron the seams open so that way they are flat against the fabric. Also, this is a good idea to iron the rest of the fabric all together so that way the material is easier to work with. Using a ruler and chalk, draw a line that is 1 inch away from the bottom of the fabric on the wrong side of the skirt. This is going to be the bottom or, well, the hem of the skirt. Fold the fabric over so that way the edge of the fabric meets the line that you just created and pin in place. Sew the hem with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That is just about where you folded the edge over to where it met the chalk line that you created. Now don't worry about being perfect just yet. No one is going to see this line of stitch work you're doing right now. Repeat the previous steps by measuring with chalk and a ruler 1 inch from the edge and then folding it over and pinning it down. Or you could do this by eye because the line has already been created and it should be straight enough, but I like to draw a guideline just for myself and also just to be very sure that I'm doing this right. Sew along with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now because I'm making a wrap skirt, I did not want those white selvage edges to be shown, so I simply folded it over and pinned in place, then sewed with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides. Because I felt that the edge was too thin and I wanted a bit more durability in the edges of the skirt, I decided to fold it over once more and sew with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. We basically repeated what we did for the hem, but did it for the sides of the skirt as well. You may set aside the skirt for now because it is time to work on the waistband. Here you can see me measuring out to the 36 mark and then cutting accordingly. Next, I folded the left and right edges over by 1 inch, then sewed with approximately a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This is where you really get a good exercise for your hand with the hand crank on your machine, because I like to finish off the top of the waistband just for durability with a stitch that is as close to the top edge as possible. So I have tried running it through the machine, but it sometimes comes out sloppy, and I just like to be absolutely sure that it's going to be neat, so I just did a hand crank all the way along. Using a needle and thread, I composed a running stitch along the top of the skirt. Now I like to hand sew this part because it makes it more precise, and that way I can make sure the gathers are just the way that I want them to be. Scrunch them up until they match the length of your waistband. Pin the waistband to the skirt, right sides facing each other, starting at the edges, then the center going outward. Be sure that the gathers are all aligned correctly before sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now this is where you have to be really careful when sewing the gathered edges because they could catch on themselves and then it'll look more like a pleat rather than a gather. So just check as you go, and it's better to go slow and do a good job than to rush through it and have to do it all over again. At this point, you can truly see the final product in sight. Oh, but hold on, because we have to finish off the edges that we just made. I decided to cut off the excess fabric so that way it wouldn't be so bulky under the bias tape. Pin the bias tape flat and open on one side of the skirt. Be sure to fold the edges over so that way they are not seen when they are sewn shut. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which this should be below the line that you created when you sewed the waistband to the skirt. Fold the bias tape over so that way it is a neat line that is covering the edges, and pin in place. Again, be sure to focus on those edges and fold them so that way they are flat. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which this should be just over the 1/4 inch seam allowance that you previously sewn. At this point, we must conduct a bit of measurements on ourselves. So here you can just see me wrapping the skirt around myself and marking where I wanted the buttons and the holes to be using the pins. I didn't have any buttons in mind for this project, so I just found some lying around the house, and I wanted one to be really good for the outside of the skirt, and then the other one just flat enough so that way it can be hidden and not be so bulky underneath the fold of the skirt. This is a little difficult to explain, but basically, both edges of the waistband are going to have a buttonhole, and then depending on how you fold it over, the button that is going to be sewn below the buttonhole will be shown outward, and then the other one is going to be sewn above the buttonhole, and it's going to be hidden from the outside of the skirt. I hope that makes sense. Now I should note that sewing a buttonhole truly depends on your machine, so I believe it's best to go with the manual on this one. Or you could look up another tutorial on how to do this. I'm not the best teacher in the world, to be honest. But it is a great idea to practice sewing and cutting open a buttonhole on a scrap kind of fabric. You don't want to try it and do it your first time on your skirt because you really don't want to ruin the masterpiece, because once you go forward, you can't go back. I sewed the buttons by hand and checked several times that all the placements were right, and finally, the skirt is complete. After 7 hours of work, I am quite pleased with how this project turned out. I hope you learned something new, and I shall see you in my next little sewing adventure. Thanks.